Hey folks, welcome back to another edition of My Car Guru. Today we are going to continue to educate and enlighten practical car knowledge. This is session number 2, the engine and the transmission. And I know that is a very big subject. A lot of components underneath the hood and underneath you as you sit in the car. But, I think it's important for you to have some kind of reasonable practical knowledge about what's in there. And because you will hear, if you have issues with your engine or your transmission, you will hear these terms thrown around. And I just want to make sure that when you go in there and you're talking to a service advisor, a mechanic, an independent shop, some shade tree guy, and he says you need a new torque converter. What is that? Why is that important? What part of your vehicle does it reside in? Those kind of things. We just got a load of Mavericks in. That's the little truck from Ford. Unfortunately, that little sucker is built in Mexico. And, the tariff is definitely going to impact it. Still, nobody really understands exactly how the tariffs are going to be applied. Because, for example, on a F-250 built in Louisville, Kentucky, well, it is assembled in Louisville, Kentucky, but if it's got a 6.7 liter diesel engine in it, that engine is made in Canada, will be subject to a 25% tariff. So all of a vehicle won't be subject to the entire tariff amount. In many cases, I saw an example a little while ago in Automotive News. It said that if the domestic content of a vehicle is 55%, then only 45% of it will be tariffed. Can you imagine, as good as the government is at keeping track of stuff, they're going to try to track something like that with every single automotive manufacturer and every single component in a car traveling to and fro across borders? I'm sorry, that sounds very cumbersome, inefficient, and maybe something that DOJ needs to take a look at. Or maybe not. Okay, so I guess it's important to look at the big picture here. Although the short term is painful, the long term may be a good thing. Trump's goal is to get automakers to start investing, start moving, and shift production here where they will pay no tariff. That apparently is the ultimate goal. I get that. What do we do in the meantime, though? That's the problem. If you're in the market for a new car, you probably ought to buy it. Let's say that sometime in the next 6 months, you're going to be in the market for a new car. You probably ought to buy it within the next month. I'm serious, because they're going to go up. And they're going to go up, and you're going to get no extra value for it. So you're just going to be paying more money. And that's because the tariffs are going to be passed on to you. Sales, 22% equals the share of new vehicles sold in the United States in 2024 that were imported from Canada and Mexico. 22% of the vehicles sold here. That's a bunch of cars. Cost. The cost of many North American vehicles could increase $4,000 to $12,000 with 25% tariffs imposed on imports from Canada and Mexico. Or is that Canada? It's going to be really interesting to see what dealers do during this same time period. Because right now, the inventory that we have in stock, we've got a huge inventory of new vehicles right now, Nissans and Fords. And when the price increases hit, then we could have incoming inventory that's priced $3,000 to $10,000 more than the current inventory that we have. So it's going to make it hard to sell that more expensive inventory. So what are dealers going to do? Some of the shady guys are just going to go ahead and mark up everything because they think there's going to be a mad rush for people to come to the dealerships and buy cars before the tariffs hit. So they're going to, put supplemental window stickers on it. Who knows what these yahoos are going to call it? It'll be some type of a surcharge. Remember during the pandemic how, I went to look at one of those storage buildings It was made out of, well, this particular one's made out of wood. They build them all over the place. You see them everywhere. Can't believe people have that much stuff to store. As if we don't have enough places that you can store your stuff in these mini warehouses and things. People got to buy all these little buildings to store more of their stuff. But I went to look at one of those one day, and I was just reading the window sticker that was stuck inside one, and it said surcharge for lumber. And it was 16%. I said, what's this about? He said, well, the lumber that we have coming in is going to be 16% more expensive than this lumber. I said, well, charge more for it. Don't charge more for this one. But they were going ahead and doing that just to offset some of those additional material costs. So I don't know how all this is going to play out. All I know is that if you're in the market for a car, you probably ought to act pretty soon and take advantage of the pre-tariff pricing. Okay, I'll be back in just 1 minute. Okay, let's impart some practical knowledge about engines first, and let's start at the very bottom of the engine where there's a swimming pool. Well, it's really not a pool, it's an oil pan. And that's where all the oil goes when your engine is turned off. If you pull a dipstick, you know what a dipstick is? If you pull that to check your oil, then that dipstick is going down into the oil pan. And that's why you're only supposed to check your oil in most vehicles when the engine is cold. And the dipstick is all the way down inside the oil pan. You pull it out, you wipe it off, you stick it back in there. It'll tell you what your oil level is when the engine's cold. Now, this is one of the reasons why you need to let your engine warm up just a little bit, especially when it's really cold, is because there's a pump down in the bottom of that oil pan. And as soon as you turn the engine on, that pump activates and starts pushing oil to the top of the engine, where it just slowly works its way back down to the pan and then gets pumped back up to the top of the engine. And you can imagine if there's a bunch of crud in the engine, or if your oil filter is stopped up because you haven't changed your oil recently, and the oil quality is not good, then you can see how that could potentially damage the internal components of an engine. Not the least of which would be the next component as we go up, would be the engine block itself. A lot of people look at that and say, well, that's an engine. Well, it's the heaviest part of an engine. Sometimes they're made out of steel or iron. Sometimes they are made out of aluminum. And engine blocks are in different types of configurations. You've heard of a inline four-cylinder. Now we sell a lot of vehicles that have three-cylinder engines. And those are three pistons just lined up, or cylinders lined up in a straight line. Four cylinders typically are two. There were some V4s that were made. I think Saab made a V4 and a V2, believe it or not. That didn't have a lot of power. But typically the more cylinders you have, then the more potential for power. Now, it's funny how things have changed over the years. A lot of the three-cylinder vehicles that we sell that are sold in the United States, not just by us, we have several models that use a three-cylinder engine. They have turbochargers on them, which make them more powerful than a lot of the V6s that used to be sold several years ago. Plus, they're a lot more fuel efficient. But inside that engine block are some very critical components: the pistons, the connecting rods, and the crankshaft. Now, in some blocks, you also have the camshaft, and I'll tell you what it does in just a minute. But the crank basically converts the up and down motion of the pistons to rotational motion, which is required in order to turn the transmission and all the gears in the transmission and eventually get back to the rear differential to turn the wheels. There's a lot of potential places for failure in an engine. Like I said, usually it's due to lack of proper lubrication. Sometimes it can be because of excessive heat. It could be because of a certain gasket that fails. And typically it's, if you let it go for more than a few miles, when something like that happens, like a blown head gasket, then it can lead to catastrophic engine failure. So when the oil light comes on, you pull over. You don't say, well, I can make it home. Those are the famous last words, as they say. You can't make it home. If the temperature light comes on, you pull over. If the check engine light comes on, you may not pull over. The main things that you need to worry about are coolant, the engine getting too hot, or the engine running out of oil. Okay, sitting on top of the engine block are typically, three components or two components. Okay, three components if it's a V-shaped block. That would be two different cylinder heads and an intake. If it's like a four-cylinder or a three-cylinder, just an inline six-cylinder, it will just have one cylinder head and then an intake mounted probably on the side of the engine. Now, what do? Well, in the cylinder heads are little round valves. They have a little stem attached to them, and they go up and down based on the rotation of the camshaft. Remember the camshaft I was talking about? The camshaft can actually be mounted in the block on older style engines, but there are engines called overhead cam engines, which has the camshaft right there connected pretty much really close to where the valves are. And that's a more efficient design. Sometimes the other design are called push rod engines, because that camshaft is buried deep in the engine block and you need some way to get up to the valves where you can open and close them, and that's what the push rods do. They just look like a big long metal straw, and it goes to the top of the engine, connects to something called a rocker arm, which when it pushes up on the rocker arm, then the other side of the rocker arm pushes down to open up the valve. Isn't that amazing? So the valves open up and it lets air into the engine. Those are the intake valves, and then the other valve opens up. It's an exhaust valve, and it lets exhaust out, and it goes out through the exhaust manifold and out to your tailpipe. So there's a guy named Nicholas Otto. He was born when was he born? 1832 in Germany, and he's credited with designing this whole process. It's called the Otto cycle, and it was an alternative to the steam engine, but basically we call it today a four-stroke engine. And the four strokes or four processes of an engine are intake, compression, power, and exhaust. That's what's going on inside of your engine. And we can really get into the weeds here if we're not careful. And I guess the main points that I want to make as far as this, maybe make an impression that there's a lot of moving parts inside your engine. And those require the right temperature, and they require a lot of lubrication. So it's just critical that you get your engine serviced, that it has clean filters, including air filters. There's a lot of different things. Fuel filters. The oil filter is just one of many, and that's typically the one that people pay attention to, if they pay attention to anything, is just replacing the oil filter. Now they have cabin air filters. Sometimes I think the manufacturers come up with all these filters to create long-term maintenance things that we have to spend money on. Of course, that would be the cynical view. But temperature is critical. I just drove, yesterday, I drove my 1934 Ford Phaeton. I drove it maybe 5 miles, pulled back into the service drive, and I could smell antifreeze. I could smell it. It's a very sweet smell. I said, okay, this is not good. So I walk around to the front. I lay down. That's not easy for me to do since my hip is loose, but I laid down on the ground, looked up under, and I saw a drip, drip, drip. And I couldn't see exactly where it's coming from, so I called one of my technicians to come over and look at it, and he said, it's coming from an overflow outlet. Well, see, on a 1934 model, I know what an overflow tank is on a cooling system on a modern vehicle, but not on a 34. So it's just one more thing. But just imagine, I'm on a nice drive with my wife. We're going through the countryside in that car, just looking at the birds and the bees and the trees and enjoying spring, and all of a sudden steam starts coming out of the radiator cap on my 1934. That's no good. It's because it's overheated. And that will definitely destroy an engine. One more story about engines getting destroyed. Had some good friends of mine that were coming home from Knoxville, and their engine just quit. It just basically locked up. They pulled over on the side of the road. They were on Highway 11E. They called me rather than calling a wrecker. I rushed down there to take care of them. They were in their late 80s. And I look inside and I see, it's pouring antifreeze all over the ground. I look inside on their dash, covered with pictures of their family members, grandkids, kids. They couldn't see the lights. So if the engine temperature light came on, they would have never known it. Obviously, they didn't know it. And their engine was toast. And I'm talking about a complete replacement. in a Toyota Camry. So that's what happens. Let's talk about the transmission for just a minute. Basically, there's basically one type of manual transmission, which you don't see very often anymore. Very few cars have manuals. Nissan sells, one vehicle with a manual. That's a Versa, and I don't think we can get those anymore. And Ford, the Mustang, the Bronco, and I think that's it that you can get with a manual transmission. Most people don't want them. They don't want to mess with it. If you're a sports car guy like me, you'd prefer it because it's just, I don't know, it just makes me feel more involved in driving. I just like the way they sound. My Porsche has a manual transmission. It's a 7-speed manual. The 34 Ford is a 3-speed unsynchronized manual transmission. You know what unsynchronized means? It means that you have to be able to double clutch it, match the engine speed to the transmission speed to be able to shift gears. I know that sounds complicated. The average person could never do it without some lessons. And I'm not giving those lessons. Okay, the other types of transmissions, well, basically there's 3 types of automatic transmissions. It's probably what you're driving now. You have one of those cars that has little paddle shifters on the steering wheel. You know, I've sold cars to people, and they come back a couple years later and they say, hey, what do these do? You know, it's because I did a lousy job showing them what the paddle shifters do. But they just allow you to shift the transmission manually if you want to. Why would you want to do that? Well, because you're driving through the mountains, and sometimes automatics will lug a little bit. They won't be in the right gear when you're going up a hill and you like it to downshift, but you can't get it to, so you just downshift it with your hand. I like paddle shifters. The vast majority of high-performance sports cars, Ferraris, even the M-Series BMWs, Lamborghinis, Jaguars, McLarens, they all use paddle shifters because they're quicker. They can shift in a millisecond. You can get around any kind of a racetrack, or especially a road course, a whole lot faster with paddle shifters than you can with a manual transmission. Humans can't shift fast enough. So 3 different types of automatics. The first is a CVT. That stands for continuously, easy for me to say, continuously, nailed it, continuously variable transmission. So what this is, I'm not going to get into the details too much, but it is a transmission for lighter weight vehicles, and it is much more efficient than a typical transmission because it's basically always in gear. It uses cones, and it uses there's no gears in it. Cones and belts, basically. You know, if you ever ridden in a 4-wheeler or had a 4-wheeler or like one of these side-by-sides, they use CVT transmissions because they're very simple. They respond quickly, and you don't have gears shifting all the time. Now, modern CVTs, they found out that people like to feel gear shifts. They don't feel like it's doing anything, and the engines were revving up really strangely, and people just didn't like them. So the engineers created a situation where they will still shift, and you'll feel that shift, and the RPMs will drop like it does on a regular transmission, and that seems to make people happy. Okay, so CVTs are more efficient than a regular torque converter transmission, which is the second type of transmission. Believe it or not, a torque converter automatic transmission is driven by fluid because it has something called a torque converter in it, and that sits between the engine and the transmission gears, and it spins. It has a set of vanes on one end of it and a set of vanes on the other. There's fluid in the middle. When one set of vanes starts spinning, eventually all that fluid starts spinning, and it starts the other vanes to a spinning. How's that for grammar? So there is no direct connection between the flywheel on the engine and the gears in the transmission except this fluid, and it works pretty well. And it has for years and years and years. And most of the vehicles, all the trucks that you're out there driving, you know, really, well, I'd say probably 50% of the vehicles out there have a torque converter transmission. Many years ago, they figured out, well, we need to get more efficiency out of this. So when it gets up into the higher speeds, they figure out a way to put a clutch in there that would lock up and have a direct connection between the flywheel that's connected to the engine and the gears and the transmission. So that eliminated a lot of the inefficiency of a torque converter automatic transmission, but not enough. And so that's why they came out with CVTs. The third type of automatic transmission is something I'll get to here in just 1 minute. Okay, I know you're dying to hear what the third type of automatic transmission is. I know my wife, she can't wait to know what the third type of automatic transmission is. It is called a dual clutch automatic, and it has been around for a long time. It has been around in Europe for a long time. It is, get this, it is a manual transmission that shifts automatically. It's got 2 clutches in it instead of 1. One is for the odd gears, the other is for the even gears. The benefit of it is the same thing about putting a clutch in a torque converter automatic. It eliminates the slippage that you have when you're just driven by fluid. So they work pretty well. However, when Ford, for example, decided to put a dual clutch transmission in the Ford Focus, it was a failure. One, because people didn't service their transmissions often enough, and 2, Americans aren't used to a transmission that shifts that way. It was weird. It would get confused sometimes, and people thought their transmission was going to fall out on the road, when in fact it wasn't. But a lot of that was due to dust particles getting into the serious business works of this transmission, causing failures, and we've replaced a bunch of them. Ford actually extended the warranty on these to, like 150,000 miles, and that was nice of them. So I hope you got something out of the fundamentals of this stuff. If you need more in-depth training, one place I like to go is to this website called howstuffworks.com. howstuffworks.com. I've learned a lot there about certain things. Like I didn't know how an air conditioning compressor worked, nor did I know how a Tesla rocket ship can land itself and get grabbed by those scissors, whatever they are. That made no sense to me. So I went to howstuffworks.com and that explained it. So other more simple questions, you can call me 423-552-2020, or you can send me an email to lennylawson2020@gmail.com, and I'll see you next time.